Hello, everybody. Welcome back and to the second segment on Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. And since you've been processing, I actually another whole day went by, and this is actually Monday evening here in Chicago, so this will be pretty hot off the press by the time that you see this tomorrow morning. I hope you're doing well, and I hope that God is giving you the continued grace to take in all that He has for you during these 2 weeks, to receive it, to apply it, to think deeply about it, and look at how it relates to your own life as well as to your ministry context. I know that I'm having the same exact experience here. I'm in the middle of a 2 week intensive, and the only thing I can say is the intensive is intensive. It is taking all of my mental, emotional, physical, spiritual energy, as I'm sure it is for you too. Um, so I want to continue now looking at the next stage of Erikson's theory, which is the stage of the childhood elementary school years. And this, of course, is ages 6 to 12. And Erikson identifies this as the time where the conflict is between industry and inferiority. And if you remember, Erikson's theory is really based on looking at different crises that people go through in life and that as they work through the crisis, that it will determine how well they're able to relate to others and actually live and develop more of a wholeness in their lives. And the goal here for Erikson is the issue of competence. And of course, those of you that have worked with children at this age, some of you probably have children at this age. 6 to 12 is an amazing time of life for kids. They're going to school. Whether they're homeschooled or privately schooled or in a public school situation, they're learning so much. They have the capacity now to read. They're on this huge learning curve. All the subject areas are opening up to them because they're able to read, and they're processing and learning so much. Most children enjoy learning at this age unless they have a very bad negative schooling experience. They're excited. They're learning what they do well at, and they may not, obviously not like all the subject areas in school, but it's even beyond school. They're developing the competence in lots of different areas. This is a very important time for children in this age group to complete things. And it's interesting because this is a time when kids like to try a lot of things, but if they don't like it, they want to quickly stop it and get out of it. And this is a very important time where parents and people that work with young people need to encourage them to make commitments and stick with them. For example, if a child says, I want to learn how to play the piano, and the parents sign them up for a 12-week course, and it costs X amount of money, and 2 weeks into it the child says, I don't like piano, I don't want to do this anymore. And it's very important to say, you know what, you made a commitment, it costs something, and now even if you need to keep your commitment, even if at the end you say, I'm not going to continue it, that's fine, but you need to complete it. This is a time when young people are learning to what it means to make a commitment, what it means to make a time commitment, learning how to manage things. And this is a time when it's very important for them to have a sense of competence and a sense of industry. In other words, they're capable of doing things. They're not capable of doing everything because no one is, but they are developing competence in the areas where God has gifted them and where we're encouraging them. I've noticed even in our DTS program, some of the young people are coming in and they've never ever completed anything. They were always allowed to stop and start, and they start something, they don't finish it, and for some people, getting the certificate that they've completed a DTS is a very significant moment in the lives of some of these young people, because for the first time ever they actually completed something. So this is a time when, it's important to work with young people, to allow them to try things, to see what they're good at, what they're not good at, to come alongside of them and to help them. Even again, just like preschoolers, these kids are going to make messes. They're going to make mistakes because they're learning. And if we constantly push them aside because we say, oh, it takes too much time, I can do it faster myself, that they will never learn. I remember when I think I was about 12, and my mother asked me to help prepare dinner one night, and she had to work, and so my dad was going to come home from work, and I needed to prepare dinner for him and my sisters and myself. And so she said to me, Camille, part of dinner tonight that you need to prepare are boiled potatoes. And I said, well, okay. And she already had them cut, and they were in the pot with the water on top of them. And I said, how long do they need to cook? She said, 10 minutes. Well, I'm a very logical, linear type of person, and when I turned them on, and exactly 10 minutes later, I turned them off. She had failed to tell me you wait until they begin to boil, and then you let them cook for 10 minutes. So you can imagine my dad came home from work, and he's got these little stones, on his plate because the potatoes didn't cook. Another time she asked me to make coffee, but she failed to tell me, about putting water in the pot. I put the coffee grounds in, but I didn't put the water in. And of course, these are the kinds of things that, kids are going to make mistakes. They're going to make messes. You can imagine, some kids, you ask them to put something in a blender and they forget to put the top on and they hit the button and everything goes all over the place. But this is a time for kids to try things, experiment, learn competence. It's very, very important. And this is something, in your ministry context, as you're working with people who have children or you're discipling even younger people, and even into adolescence, this whole area of competence is very important. Everyone needs to experience um, that blessing of being able to realize what they're good at. And that we need to look for that as disciplers and people who are working with young people. We need to have eyes to see, what are they good at? What can we affirm in them? What can we draw out of them and encourage them in? Very, very important time of life. And of course, the opposite of industry is a sense of inferiority. Inferiority. I can't do anything right. I'm not good at anything. You hear kids say that a lot of times. And you have to continue to encourage them and say, I see this, you do really well at this. Of course, this is the time when they're comparing themselves with other people, and because they're in, broader social settings. And so they'll say, well, I can't do that as well as Susan can do it. And so we have to keep pointing out to people, no, but you can do this really well. And of course, some of this idea of inferiority carries right on over into adulthood, where we compare ourselves with other people and say, oh, if I could only, lead a one-on-one like that, if I could only preach like that, if I could only, have that energy level. And we tend to compare ourselves, and instead of looking at what we do well and our competence in those areas, we always tend to say, well, I'm incompetent or I'm inferior. And this is often where it begins. And I love this little picture that my Belarusian friend picked out. This poor girl looks just so forlorn, and I don't know why she picked out such a sad-looking picture, but obviously many times children kind of look like this. They're especially if they don't feel like they are competent in anything. All right, the next stage is, and let me just read the slide, it says children need to cope with new social and academic demands. Success leads to a sense of competence, while failure results in feelings of inferiority. So again, that's the main conflict that Erikson identifies in this age bracket, is industry versus inferiority. Now, of course, we also have to help young people realize that, how to deal with failure, because we're all going to fail. And also how to deal with success, because if we're all, highly successful people often can be struggling with issues of pride. So we have to learn how to deal with success as well as failure, and that's also a matter of discipleship. Okay, the next stage is the stage of adolescence, which of course, this is, Erikson's identifying this as 12 to 18. There's a lot of discussion and literature out there today that says that in some cultures, adolescence is extending even to the age of 30. And this is actually common now in the Western world, especially with the economic problems, and young people graduate from college, they move back home with their parents, and there's that kind of like they're in and out, in and out. So adolescence has typically been understood to end at about 18, although in many cultures, these young women are being married off at the age of 14, 15. They're having children by the time they're 16, 17. They never really experience an adolescent period. But for the sake of discussion, Erikson identifies this as that age 12 to 18, and he talks about the conflict is between identity versus role confusion. And I can imagine that you've already discussed some of this in the book Anatomy of the Soul and Hiding from Love, and this turbulent time in adolescence where people are really struggling to find their identity. This is not only their sexual identity or their gender identity, but it also has much more to do with who am I, what's my sense of self, why am I here, what's my purpose, trying to wrestle with a lot of identity formation in this period. And actually, Erikson didn't say this, but Frank and Catherine Fabiano always taught that in the adolescent period, the young people actually have an opportunity to re-experience the different stages up until this point. So if you'll remember, I'll just recap them quickly. The very first stage was trust versus mistrust. And even before that, if you look in utero, it's the question of am I accepted or rejected? You can clearly see this in adolescence. Early adolescence, 12, 13 years old, these young people, they desperately want to know they're accepted. That's a big deal for teenagers. Am I accepted for who I am, no matter what I look like, what color my hair is, how many tattoos I've got, whether I've got acne or on my face, but this whole thing of being accepted and not rejected, very, very big deal at this age time. And then, of course, another one is the sense of autonomy. For a 2-year-old, the sense of autonomy is saying, no, I don't want to pick up my toys. Or, no, I don't want to eat my food. Or, no, I don't want to go to bed. But for an early adolescent, they're doing the same exact thing. They're setting boundaries to say, I am autonomous. I have my own identity. Now they'll start saying, no, I don't want to go with the family. I want to go with my friends. Or, no, I don't like the curfew that you gave me. I want to stay out later than that. They're pushing the boundaries. And then, just like a 2-year-old can throw a tantrum on the floor, I've seen teenagers throw tantrums too. It's the same exact thing. They're trying to establish their autonomy. And of course, this is normal. I mean, because they're in this transition now between the family and shifting their identity towards their peer group, and their faith has to become their own. They're starting to, they're emerging in their bodies. This is the time of puberty. So many things are changing in the lives of young people, and they are grappling with their identity. This is also when they're trying to explore, like a 3 or 4-year-old would try to explore new things. So do adolescents. That's when in America, they want to start learning how to drive when they're 14, 15 years old, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, watch out. I remember when I was learning how to drive, and I had learned how to drive a stick shift car in driver's ed, but I didn't do it very well. And I had my dad had a Volkswagen, and you had to shift the gears, and I could not get started out of first gear without the car cutting off on me. So I prayed for green lights wherever I went so that I wouldn't have to stop and start out of first gear again. But we're exploring, your first date, your first time to drive the car, your first job. You're exploring, what does it mean to make my own money? What does it mean to what kind of dress style do I want to have? Oh, just so many things where young people are exploring and pushing boundaries. And then, of course, the stage we just looked at, young people are trying to find out, what are they good at? And sometimes, they really need help, and some people to come alongside them and continue to point out what they're good at, because they feel lost. They don't know what they're good at. A lot of times I see young people go to college in their late teens, early 20s. They have no idea what they want to do. They just go to college because it's the thing to do. When they get out with a degree, they can't even get a job. And they're not even interested in it anymore. Many of these young people don't even really find their niche until the late 20s. Now, I'm talking from a Western point of view here. And of course, Erikson is saying that the key goal here in this stage is fidelity, or faithfulness. Learning how to become who you are and establishing your identity. I wanted to read a couple of quotes for you out of a book that speaks about Erikson quite a bit. And he says that, of course, in this period of time of adolescence, one of the essential aspects of identity includes your sexuality. And that this amazing, overwhelming power of sexuality becomes a very important part of your identity as an adolescent. But he also writes, this author writes that the sexuality is also heightened by a sense of loneliness. And he says that adolescents, for the first time, really become more conscious of this deep feeling of inner emptiness, which can only be filled spiritually. And I thought that was a very interesting comment, because I think that's very true, that when adolescents, if you think about their intellectual development, they're able to think abstractly, they're asking a lot of questions they've never asked before, and they're wrestling with things like this void on the inside, the shifting emotions that adolescents often go through. And this is something that the author writes related to Erikson. It says, as Erikson says, the optimal male-female situation is talking, playing, and talking. Intense emotional exchanges and talking. And then he says this, when the relationship becomes dependent on the physical aspect, it is a dying or dead relationship. In other words, your identity is not just about your body. Your body is a big part of your identity, but it's not all of it. And so it's preparation for, this stage of life is preparation for learning how to have intimate relationships, not only physically intimate, but intellectually, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. So I thought that was a couple of really good comments related to the adolescent stage here. This, of course, is where there's an awful lot of confusion, especially today, when young people are encouraged to experiment sexually in all directions. I mean, in today's world, this hooking up culture in the West, doesn't matter whether it's heterosexual or homosexual, it's just hook up with anybody and see which direction you might be led into, which is so very dangerous and so very destructive. Young people are questioning their, what does it mean to be female? What does it mean to be male? Do I measure up? Their identity is often called into question by other people. This time of life can be very cruel for young people. When I was in the 8th grade, I was 14 years old, and I remember that one of the really popular girls in school, who was a cheerleader and everybody liked her, she decided she didn't like me. I don't know why. I mean, I wasn't carrying a briefcase anymore. I did that when I was 12, but I abandoned it after a year. So anyway, she didn't like me. I made all A's. I was I was kind of the academic person. Anyway, literally, this is not an exaggeration. That young woman convinced everybody to not talk to me. And for my 8th grade year of school, I ate alone, walked alone, sat alone. Nobody spoke to me except the teachers. Now, can you imagine? I mean, such a terribly vulnerable time in life to be so, uh, ignored at that period of time. And I was a Christian and I was struggling. What in the world do you do with that? And I remember writing in my journal at the end of that year, I will do whatever it takes to fit in. Now that's a terrible decision to make. I consciously wrote that down. I will do whatever it takes. And of course that led into, some behavior in the next few years that, was not very positive. And I had to, repent of that later on, in my early 20s. But it was very destructive. Kids can be really cruel at this time. There recently in the news, there was a 12-year-old girl in Florida who committed suicide because she was being bullied on the social networking sites. Peers, 12, 13, 14-year-old kids were writing things to her like, why don't you just die? And she committed suicide. This is a time where we really need to understand that young people need us. They need us to come alongside of them, listen to them, encourage them, pray for them, do things with them, and really, in a sense, really, these young people, they want boundaries. They won't admit it, but they really need the security of having boundaries of people that really love and care about them. All right, the next stage that Erikson talks about, I'll just read this last slide. It says, teens need to develop a sense of self and personal identity. Success leads to an ability to stay true to yourself. That's the faithfulness part. While failure leads to role confusion and a weak sense of self. And people that have a weak sense of self are often people that do things they regret later. They try to just please people. They go along with the crowd. And but they don't have enough integrity on the inside. Integrity in a sense of they don't have enough sense of who they are to stay true to themselves. As someone has once said, if you don't know who you are, how can you be self-sacrificial if you don't even know who you are? All right, the next stage is young adulthood, and Erikson describes the conflict here as intimacy versus isolation, and this is the time frame, he says, 18 to 25, and he says the key goal here or purpose is love. And this is, of course, a very formative time in a young person's life. This is young adulthood. Many young people marry at this age. Now, there is a delaying of marriage in some of the Western cultures now to where people are marrying later in the 20s or even into the 30s, but many, many people will marry by the time they're 25. And this whole issue of intimacy versus isolation, learning what does it mean to love, what does it mean to have intimate relationships. And I found some quotes here I wanted to share with you on this as well. And that I thought were really stood out to me. Let me see if I can find them here. It says here that this is the time where the interaction between our productiveness in our work and our sexuality is probably the major developmental issue at the time. And then here he's talking about Erikson, and it says, quote, Erikson carries this further to say that sooner or later, what is at stake in young adulthood is the willingness to risk fusion of one's own identity with another, to risk being absorbed into another person's world, or being the one who is absorbing another person into their world. What an amazing way of saying that, taking the risk of letting another person be so close to you, especially a marriage partner, where there's a fusion of those two people. And so this is a time where There's also a lot happening, and there's a lot of maturity taking place. People are learning to, some of the friendships you make at this period of life in the 20s can be lifelong friends. I know that for me, many of my friends now that I have in North Carolina are friends that I met in my 20s. I met them at a, uh, singles group at church, and many of us went to YWAM together, went on mission trips together, formed lasting friendships, and they're still friends of mine today. And so this is a very, very strategic time in life. I have a kind of an adopted niece, a Russian girl that a friend of mine adopted a number of years ago, and she's 24. And she really has some attachment problems. She has trouble making friends her own age. She relates more to older adults. And recently we were at the gym together, and I asked her, I said, who are you hanging out with these days? And she looked at me. She was on the other treadmill next to me. She went, have you been talking to my father? And I said, no, can't Auntie ask you? Ask my niece who she's hanging out with, and then she began to open up, and she just talked about the struggle she was having with making friends and having friends that weren't Christians and going to places where she knew she really shouldn't go, but she was desperate to try to have some kind of friendship. And just there's still an awful lot of development happening in the 20s where there's the what does it really mean to love? What does it mean to have good friendships? What does it mean, to take my place in this world? Um, I was 21 when I took my first teaching job, and it scared me to death. Um, you're learning to take responsibility. You're learning to manage your money. You're learning to make adult decisions, and they're very important. This is a very key time in life. I just want to see if there's any other quotes I wanted to read to you about this stage. Um, let's see here. No, I think that's it. But anyway, this is a very, very important stage of life where, of course, many of you are working with people in exactly this age frame. You're in the DTSs. DTSs are loaded with people in their late teens, early 20s. This is a key time to understand God's framework for relationship, God's framework for sexuality. Um, these are critical times that sets a foundation for coming into adulthood. I remember that at this period of time was when I watched the Dean Sherman series and on relationships, and it had a very formative effect on my life. Nobody in the church had ever explained God's purposes and boundaries for relationships like Dean Sherman did. I'd never heard it before. And it made so much sense to me. And I had wished that somebody had told me about it earlier. I just didn't, nobody had said anything. I had a teacher in high school. I actually took a Bible in high school. It was still offered then. And the teacher was this very stern looking man with these big horn rimmed black glasses. He said, don't you hold hands with those boys. And so he went from hand holding to having sex, outside of marriage, and never explained anything. It's like, how can we expect young people to understand God's boundaries if we don't teach them? So this is an extremely formative time, and we have to understand that young people of this age, they're dealing with a lot. Coming into DTS, many of them young believers, maybe some brand new believers, coming out of brokenness, sexual brokenness, all kinds of things. And they're dealing with competence issues, they're dealing with identity issues, they're dealing with intimacy versus isolation, the whole thing, all these different stages. What a wonderful time to be discipling young people. So I just want to encourage you as you're looking at Erikson and Fowler, and we're thinking about human growth and development, and all that we've already talked about in the other two modules about Christian formation and spiritual formation and our theology. Folks, this is absolutely critical for these young people. to get a good, solid start into adulthood, and or being able to be healed from some things, restored, and having a whole new level of understanding about the nature and character of God and why he has created the boundaries that he has. Okay, and so Erikson says young adults need to form intimate, loving relationships with other people. Success leads to strong relationships, and failure results in loneliness and isolation. Such an important time. And I think, we're, even in this class that I'm teaching right now at Trinity, we're talking a lot about community and what it means to learn in community. What it means to have relationships and strong, intimate, loving relationships. Such it is God's way to create a safe place for us to learn how to love and how to relate and how to work through differences and how to work through conflicts, how to express our emotions. And I know that in reading the book Hiding from Love, this is where a lot of this hiding from love shows up in when you start emerging into young adulthood and people don't know how to navigate these things. All right, the next stage that he discusses is middle adulthood, and this is a huge age gap here. He goes from 25 to 60. So, many of you sitting here, in the room watching this video, you fit into this bracket, and I never thought of it as 25 to 60, but then again, the older I get, the more I think 60, not so old. But Erikson says here that the conflict is generativity versus stagnation, and that the goal or the purpose is care. I really love the way he talks about this, because he says that the real issue, and this is really when people start getting into their 40s, 50s, getting close to 60. The question is, how am I going to contribute to the next generation? How am I going to remain a person that generates life by investing in others, rather than just shutting down and becoming stagnant and just kind of getting cynical and not continuing to grow and develop? Do we care enough about other people to invest in them? This is a really important stage as well, because I've read other literature that says that many people by the age of 40, they stop learning. They don't learn anything new. And if you look at the whole issue of neurobiology, you'll know that as long as we're learning, we're building new connections, new synapses in the brain, which is healthy for us. If you don't use them, you lose them. So that's my philosophy. So, all lifelong learning, which is a Christian principle, is very important, and lifelong investment into the next generation. That's why I love teaching young people. I love investing into young leaders, because I can continue to live out my life and invest my giftings into others who will go on to do amazing things in the kingdom of God. I know the last few times that I've heard Tom teach, I thought, now that's a man who's teaching with a passion to continue to invest into young people. And it is a very important season of life. And I wanted to read a couple of quotes out of this book here related to the different age brackets here. This is a quote that he starts with, and it says, this is called the middle years, and this is talking about ego transitions. And it says, two of the world's greatest masterpieces, which portray the extremities of good and evil, begin at the midpoint of the lifespan. Dante opens the Divine Comedy with this quote: midway in the journey through life, I found myself lost in a dark wood, strayed from the true path. And this author goes on to say that historically many notable people have entered into a real commitment with God at this point in their lives and have undergone conversion in midlife. And this is a time when um, obviously, you can see in the mirror that things are changing, and that we need to turn outward in a new way with new resources. And that's why Erikson calls this generativity versus stagnation. I love this. It says the turn inward means reassessing one's developmental history, discovering one's own voice, and using new resources to re-envision the future. It reminds me of Caleb and Joshua when they finally got into the promised land because they were held back by all those people that had no faith. When they finally got there, Caleb was 80 and he said, "Give me my mountain." He was still going. He still wanted his inheritance. And from a spiritual theological perspective, that's what Erikson is talking about. Not giving up, not becoming stagnant, stale, giving up on life, but becoming, even more um, oriented towards the goal of investing into others and preparing for the future. Um, let's see here. And then, so this is, I think, and of course, many of you in the room that are watching this, you're investing in the next generation because you work so much with the DTS, you work with young leaders. In this whole master's program, the whole idea is to invest in leadership. And as it continues, there'll be more investment in younger leaders. And then, of course, and then what this next slide says, adults need to create or nurture things that will outlast them. I love that. Often by having children or creating a positive change that benefits other people. Success leads to feelings of usefulness and accomplishment. Failure results in a shallow involvement in the world. And so as Christians, especially as our theology is one that sees this restoration back towards God's original intentions, seeing the kingdom of God established in the domains of society right where we live right now, knowing that, everything that we're doing here in this life, for God, it's making a difference. I think that's a very hopeful way of looking at life. And you can certainly, if you're around older people, as their physical abilities become more limited, you can see that there's a critical place where you have to really make some hard choices. I've really seen this in my mom's life in the last few years, where she has really chosen to have a very faithful, positive attitude, and loves young people and volunteers at her church, reaches out to other people. Really precious, and that's an attitude. That's a motivation of the heart. I've seen other older people get very cynical, very negative, critical of everything, and then they really do become more isolated because nobody wants to be around them. Okay, the very last stage, we're wrapping up now, folks, is called senior adults, and it goes 60 ... And as I'm getting closer to that age, I don't like that ... but um, you know, Erikson calls this ego integrity versus despair, and he says that the goal here is wisdom. And of course, wisdom, that's what we long for. We pray for that the Holy Spirit of God would grant us wisdom, and that we would, growing old doesn't necessarily mean you become a wise person. You might be a very bitter person. Growing old in body is one thing, but the kind of spirit that we have, the kind of choices we make is something else. And Erikson is talking here about despair. When people begin to lose their abilities, they can often, get very fearful and anxious. And the whole thing is all, and also with regrets, dealing with things that they wish had gone differently, or things that, they wish they had done that they didn't do. But he's also talking about, it's a time to really be affirming of life, and looking ahead, of course, as Christians, looking ahead to, this life is not all there is. Um, and then he says it's a time where we can simplify, and that there is, material things don't mean nearly as much to people. We can begin to relax our defenses. We don't have to prove anything anymore. And that I love this. He says another thing is that work can now become more of an avocation, and it's integrated into life. And this is a great quote. It says, living in the present without an anxious future is a privilege of the aged. It can come as a great relief that you cannot accept the final responsibility for the future. We can't predict or control, how we will die or when. It's just kind of, in a sense, at this stage in life, if we continuing to grow in wisdom, walking with God, there's a sense of in, just a sense of being more comfortable with who we are and being able to just be who we are. Um, so that pretty much, and then Carl, just read the last slide here. It says, older adults need to look back on life and feel a sense of fulfillment. Success at this stage leads to feelings of wisdom, while failure results in regret, bitterness, and despair. And of course, as Christians, we of all people do not need to despair, because we are headed towards seeing the Lord face to face and continuing on with his purposes forever. So here we are at the end of Erik Erikson. I hope that it has been encouraging to you. I hope it has been enlightening, and that it will be a benefit for you in your work. As you continue this week and you're looking at kind of bringing all of this together, what does it mean to be human? How do we grow and develop spiritually, emotionally, physically, in our in all the dimensions of who we are? What does it mean to work with others and to encourage their growth and to see them formed more and more into the image of Christ, set free to be more whole than ever before, and to be involved in the call of God on their lives? And I know that for myself, that goal, Lord, I want more wholeness, Jesus, more freedom to be who I really am and to use what you've placed in my life for other people and for your kingdom. Lord, bring it on. And we all have areas where we need to continue to move towards greater wholeness, areas where the Lord wants to bring understanding and healing and restoration. It never ends, because in God's economy, we're always growing. We're always being formed more and more into the image of Christ. So my prayer for you is that the Lord will give you the grace this week to continue on the journey and to see it through to the end well, and to be able to use it in a mighty way in the ministry that God has entrusted to you, wherever he's called you to work at this world. God bless you, my friends. I'm in the same situation here. I'm being stretched a lot, but it's good, and I'm thankful for it. So I'll turn it over to Pam and Laprelle, who are doing the processing of this session. God bless you, and look forward to seeing you in the fourth module in early 2014. Take care now. Bye-bye.